Alright, welcome back. In this tutorial we will be focusing on how I scan my walls and how I put them into Blender and make a camera animation. So let's dive in. Creating this video was a lot of work, and because I'm a small channel, it would really help me if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel. This way I can continue to make more videos in the future. In order to capture the wall, the only thing you need is a cell phone. What you do is you take as many pictures as possible from the climb that you're climbing and maybe even surrounding parts of the wall. You want to make sure that you cover the ground, the top, the bottom. You make sure that you cover holes from the backside, from below. You want to make sure that you get a good all-around view of everything. In this case, I actually took 103 images. Then I actually go on polycam.com, and there you can easily take all those images and generate 3D meshes from it. Here you can actually see a climb that I captured in Red Rocks, and you just click on the Create Capture button, then you say Create a 3D model, and now you can just choose the images that you shot and upload all of them to the website, and it's gonna then take those images and analyze the 3D mesh from it. You have different options, whether it's optimized for games, medium for iOS/mobile, a full that's good for like 3Ds and effect, and then a raw where they take out some of the maps. I'm a fan more of the full one. I feel like that works best for me, so I'm gonna do full, and then I'm gonna say create. And then I give it a descriptive name. I like to name it by the gym where I climbed it at, the grade, and what was specific about it. Then you upload it and you wait a little bit, and you should get a notification in the bottom right corner that your mesh is done. This is now how the full version of the mesh looks like. It doesn't look super good because I probably didn't get the best angles, like the floor is missing partially, there's a big hole in the top right corner, but for my purpose that's enough. Next I'm going onto the top right corner of the website, and I'm going to download this file as a GLTF that we're then going to import into Blender. Welcome to Blender. Let's cover the absolute basics to get you started. In case you already know them, great. If you don't, here's a first walkthrough. With middle mouse button you can tumble. With control middle mouse button you can zoom in and out. With shift mouse button you can pan. With G you can actually grab the cube and move it. If you hit G and then middle mouse button, you can snap it to an axis. If you G and then press X, Y or Z, you will actually snap it to that specific axis that you typed in. With R you can rotate it in camera space. If you hit R twice, it's going to turn into free rotate. And if you hit R and then X, Y or Z, it'll actually snap to that individual axis. So with I can actually insert keys, but if I do that in the timeline, nothing really happens because I actually haven't decided which attributes I want to key it. So I actually go into the properties with N, and here I'm just gonna press I over translates, rotates, and scales. And now once I've done this, I can press I and the timeline and it also does something. But what I like to do is actually enable auto key. And what this does is that if you just move the object, it'll just automatically set a key for you. X lets you delete keys, and this should cover the basics to let us get started. Now let's import the file into Blender. I want to go to File, Import, and GLTF. If you don't see this yet, go to Edit, Preferences, and then under Add-ons, you can search for GLTF and make sure that the checkbox is enabled. Now once you have everything set up, go to File, Import, GLTF, pick the download from Polycam, and you have your climbing scan inside of Blender. Since everything looks a little bit gray, we want to actually switch it to shaded, and you can do that in the top right corner on those spheres, and now you can see everything with the textures. Now we go into the shading tab, and what we want to do is actually assign it a different shader, because right now the current shader will actually receive shadows from any lights that we place within Blender, and what we want is a shader that doesn't receive any shadows because the photos that are currently in the texture already have the shadows baked in them. So I'm actually creating a new shader by hitting Shift A for the Add menu, and I'm gonna search for emission. With that emission shader, I'm taking the file output node, and then I'm going to take the output from the emission and I'm gonna drag and drop it into the surface on the file output. Next, I wanna find the texture that is going into the base color of our original climbing nodes. And I wanna grab the output of the color and wanna drag and drop that into the color of our emission shader. Now once I've done this, the climb should technically look the same that it did before, because the result will only be really noticeable once we actually render the images. Next, let's clean up our mesh and get rid of any weird geometries that are floating around on the ground, and maybe also get rid of some of the holes that are currently there. And what I want to do is actually press tab to get into edit mode. And this will now allow me to pick certain pieces of the mesh. There are 3 different modes. You can either pick vertices, and in the top left corner you actually see buttons. 1 is vertices, 2 is edges, and 3 is faces. With 1, you can just grab a single point. With 2, you can grab an edge, and with 3, you can just grab an entire face. Now, what I want to do is use the knife tool with K, and what I'm going to do is start cutting along these edges. And I kind of want to create now areas where I want to delete stuff. Right now, if I were to delete it, it would just give me jagged lines. So I need to have like clean straight lines first. Here you can actually see me select all those faces, and then I'm going to hit X to delete them. With like bigger selections, I actually like to switch this to the lasso, which will allow me to draw more of a shape in order to select faces. And once I have them selected, I just press X to delete them. And now I'm going to do like a pass around the base of the climb and just going to make it look nicer. In this case, I actually now have the edge floating above the ground and I want to pull it down. But if I just grab the edges or the vertices and pull them down, you can see it's like stretching weirdly. But there's an option called proportional editing. And if you enable this, you can now have a fall off of an area that you can adjust with your middle mouse button. And now you can pull these vertices or edges and all the adjacent ones down. So with the proportional editing enabled, I can now kind of like liquefy in Photoshop, if you're familiar with this, just start pulling things down. And I kind of eyeball things at this point. I'm not super picky about making it perfectly straight, but I kind of just want to create one even base of the climb. To make even bigger and easier adjustments, I actually like to use booleans. And what I'm going to add is a cube into the scene. And then I make sure that on this cube, I'm going to the object properties, and then in our viewport display, I set display as bounce. This will allow me to see through it and see the result of what we're doing next. Now I want to select the wall, and with the wall selected, I go to the modifier tab, and here I want to generate a boolean. And then under object, I want to actually now grab the little picker and click on the box. Now I can use this box to further cut off the wall and to make big adjustments. In this case, actually scale the cube up a little bit to cover the entire wall. Then I duplicate the cube to create a second one for the other side. And I go back into the walls modifier stack, where I now also want to create a new Boolean modifier that I will now then link to the other cube. You can see I created a new Boolean. I take the picker, I select the other cube. And then once I'm happy with the placement of the cubes, I actually apply the modifiers, so it's now baked down into the mesh, and I can delete the cubes out of my scene again. I continue to use the proportional editing method to clean up the mesh, and I really do this pass roughly because in the final video you won't really notice the difference. In order to match the camera, I actually go into a tool called F-Spy, and here you can load a reference image from the shot that you want the 3D animation to start from. In my case, that is actually the frontal view, camera 1. And now I'm going to take these guides to find major landmarks in my image that resemble the perspective of this image. Luckily, I had the staircase in it, where I can find some nice straights from the ceiling and from the actual pole of the staircase. And I'm trying to align these guides with those landmarks. This will help to create a camera that matches the perspective from which the photo was taken. Then I'm going to save this file. And in order to load this into Blender, you first have to download a plugin from the actual website. Here you can find the download on GitHub, and all you want to download is this zip file. Once you've downloaded this, you can return back to Blender, and then under Edit Preferences in the Add-ons tab, you can go to Install, pick the zip file, and enable the plugin. Once that's done, you can go to File, Import, pick F-Spy, and load the camera we had just saved out of F-Spy. This will now give you the camera in space, and it may not be placed correctly. In this case, it is actually upside down because I picked the wrong coordinates in F-Spy, but that's not a big problem. I'm creating actually an empty, and I can now constrain the camera with a child of constraint to that empty, which will now allow me to just rotate the empty node. And what I do here is press R, X, and then type in 180. And that'll spin the entire camera from the pivot of the empty by 180 degrees. Now I can press tilde, which is the button above the tab button, and I can go to View Camera and switch to my camera to look through it. Now the camera view comes with a background image automatically set up. In this view, I want to roughly position and scale the wall into place. Now, with the camera selected, under the camera settings, you can actually adjust that background image, and I like to set it to front and then dial down the transparency so you can look through it, and that'll help you match your 3D mesh to the actual background. With the Shift plus right mouse button, you can actually place a 3D cursor onto your mesh, which will allow you to now set this point as the pivot for your mesh. Now, there is a quick favorites menu that I like to use, and you can very easily add items to it by just right-clicking onto something that you see in the menu and say add to quick favorites. Now, when you press Q, you can always access this. You can at any point in time right-click onto something and remove them as well. Things that I like to add are frame selected or set origin to 3D cursor. And we're gonna add under object, set origin to 3D cursor as an option. You want to right click on it and say add to favorites. From here on, you should be able to just press Q and quickly access this option. This works with any menus within Blender. Now I'm gonna set the origin for that point that I roughly matched into place, and I'm gonna keep adjusting pivots as I try adjusting the wall. Sometimes it's good to maybe find like a point that has a lot of lines that you can match easily with it. In this case, I took the bottom of the wall, where I felt like I can use the actual paintings that are on the wall as a point of reference. And I roughly try to scale it, maybe tilt a little bit towards camera, move it around a little bit. And here I've gotten really close, but I actually keep playing around with this and keep tweaking a little bit until I really get it bulletproof. And if any one of you knows better ways how to do this, this is pretty much just me fudging around. It can take quite a while and it's a little bit of a trial and error, but I keep adjusting and changing pivots and scaling this back and forth until I feel like it's good enough to just call it a day. And this is how it now looks like, going back and forth. It's super close. It's not perfect, but in this case, this is more than enough. Now I'm going to create another child constraint on the camera, and I will actually select the wall as a target because I want to move the wall with the camera to better position it in space. With animation, it's always good if your general direction is aligned with the X and Y and Z axis. What I'm trying to do in this case is actually align the general direction of the wall with the X axis and bring it as close as possible to the scene origin. Now that the wall is positioned properly, I'm going to start further prepping the actual wall. Now we're going to go back into edit mode and zoom into one of these holes. Now I want to actually grab the knife tool and start cutting around the actual shape of this hole. And what I want to create once again is just edges so I can later on select all of these holes and actually separate them. I do this with all holes first. So first I go in there and start cutting out all the lines. And once I am done, I will now actually go back to the first hole and I will now start selecting all the faces of that hole. And once I have everything nicely selected, I will then press P for separate and I will separate selection. This will now make this hole its own mesh that I can now control individually. And I want to create this with every hole on the wall. So now I select everything, I press P and I repeat the process until I have all holes separated from the actual wall element. Once everything is cut out, the wall should look like this, and you can then turn all the holes back on. And now I'm actually gonna organize things into collections, and I want to create one collection per object. So I have one for the wall, and then I put every hole into its own separate collection. And then I take all the holes and move them into a parent group called holes. To make this look a little nicer, I actually add a cylinder as a base that I roughly put into position. Then I'm gonna give it a simple shader with a dark gray color. I add a sphere as the dome in my scene and with a subdivision modifier on it to make it look smooth. Also giving it a darker gray color on the shader. And now that everything is in place, we're gonna start adding lights to the scene. So I'm gonna take a point light and I roughly put it into position. At this point, I wanna make sure that my renderer is actually set to cycles. And I also make sure that it's set to GPU, because otherwise this could be super slow, and I've made this mistake many times before. And in the top right corner of the viewer, you can now set it to render view. This will actually now use cycles in your viewport to render this view. With the light selected, I can now go to the light properties tab and start increasing the power to 5000 watts to see more of a result in the viewport. Then I'm going to change the color of the first light to an orange tone, and I want to disable cast shadows. Now I want to move it fairly close to the wall in the background and then duplicate the point light and change the color of the second light blue. This will give us a nice contrast and complementary tones. Then I'm going to increase the subdivision levels on the background sphere to make the sphere smooth. And with some smaller adjustments, we should be ready to jump to the next step, which is the camera animation. To animate the camera easily, I actually want to adjust the UI a little bit, and you can right click onto the connections of your UI and then horizontal or vertical split them. In this case, I want to vertical split the viewer to give me two viewports next to each other. On the left one, I can now start moving the camera, and on the right side, I can see it update. But there's another way that you can also animate the camera by pressing N and to go into your properties panel and check camera to view. With this enabled, you can now, in the viewport that has the camera enabled, start zooming in and out, and it'll actually adjust the camera for you immediately. Now I want to turn on auto key and start setting rough positions for the camera. I go through the entire edit and mark my areas that I like to cover, and then I take the first frame and copy it at the end, which will now make the video loop seamlessly. This first pass usually looks pretty janky. It might be way too fast in areas or too slow in others, or maybe even the overall trajectory looks kind of weird. But something you can do under the object properties of the camera, you can enable a motion path. And this is a great way to visualize how the camera is moving through space and also how fast it's traveling. You can see all these little dots, and as I actually start increasing the keyframe gaps between each other and update the motion path, you can see that also now the points between the two keyframes has increased. And now I actually go through the edit and I start changing the timing of my keys to overall kind of match the same type of frame density across the entire path. At this point, I might also make adjustments to the overall trajectory, and if there are any very straight areas, I might push the camera a little bit out to give this a little bit more of a round, organic motion. Once I'm happy with the overall trajectory, I go into the graph editor and start cleaning the curves of my camera. In general, if there are any kinks, it's good to maybe delete a keyframe of that curve and smoothen it out. And now with the camera in place, we can jump into the render layers. We already went through the work of organizing our scene earlier, and this will actually now come in handy because we will start setting up render layers. Now I actually want to go back and create a few more extra groups for the objects we have just created. So I want to make one for the background, one for the ground, and then one for the lights. And with all these in place, we can now rename this first layer in the top right corner to all. Then I want to go to the filter options and show hold out and indirect only, which will be crucial for our render layers. Here's an example where I set the wall to hold out and the background to indirect. And what you can see is that if I actually start panning around the wall, the holes will be covered by the wall, but everything would still be rendered transparent. If I set the wall to disable, you can actually see through it. If I set it to indirect, I will still be able to see the holes from the background, and it will also render it that way. But with holdout, it'll actually now pretend that the wall is cutting it off, but still have everything else be transparent. In the top right corner, you can now create a new render layer, and I'm going to call this one wall. Now here I want to set the ground to holdout and the background to indirect, which will give me the result of just having a single layer where I only see the wall and nothing else. Then I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this all holes, and I'm going to set the wall to holdout, the background to indirect, which will now give me a render of all holes and nothing else. Now let's duplicate this layer and call it hold. And here I want to actually start hiding all holes except the very first one. Then I duplicate this one, I call it hold.001, and I'm gonna now reveal one hold after another and always create a new layer so that I have individual layers with just one hold visible at a time. And I go through all the holds, so I have separate layers for each one of them. Then we want to set up the background, which will be easy because we can just hide the wall and the ground and the holes. And then we're going to set up the ground, and for this I want to set the background to indirect and set all holes, including the wall, to hold out. Then we're going to jump into the compositing tab, and here we want to enable the use nodes checkbox in the top left corner. This will now give us 2 nodes and add a file output node. Now you could grab the connection from the composite node and pull it into the file output node, but there's a better plugin. Under edit preferences add-ons, you search for node wrangler and make sure that this is enabled. Now you can alt right mouse drag from one node onto the other and it'll connect them. And with control right mouse button, you can actually cut a connection between 2 nodes. Now the first render layer I want to set to wall, and then I'm going to start duplicating them to match the amount of render layers I have in my scene. Then I'm going to make sure that each of my render layers is set in one of these nodes. Ideally, to keep better track of things, I assign them in the same order as they are listed. Now on the file output node, I want to go into the properties panel by pressing N, and on the node tab, I can now assign a folder where I want my files to be saved. I want to use the file format to be PNG, and I want to make sure that it's set to RGBA to also save the alpha channel. Then I create additional inputs that match the amount of render layers that I have, and I start naming them exactly the same way. Now I'm connecting each matching render layer with the matching input on the file output node, and we should be ready for rendering. Because we're rendering an animation, we want to make sure that our frames don't render too long. So what I like to do is actually decrease my samples by quite a bit, and I start out by setting 300. Then I like to enable denoise actually, which will help quite a bit with our render times and making it look prettier due to the low sample size. And under Edit Preferences System, I want to make sure that my graphic card is enabled and set it to whatever is best for your graphics card. And under Light Path, I actually like to decrease this from 12 to 6 and set it to 444. And then something that's really important is actually under Film, you want to make sure that transparent is enabled, because otherwise, even if you were to render RGBA, it wouldn't render it transparent. And then the last thing I want to enable is motion blur. Now, before we render everything, I want to make sure that we render at a reasonable speed. So I'm just going to test it on a single image first. I will go to render image. Now, the first image that I rendered took 2 minutes, which is still way too long for an animation. And this includes all the render layers we have just set up. So I go back to my render settings and change the max sample count from 300 to 200, which brought my render times to 53 seconds instead of 2 minutes. And I say render animation. Once everything is rendered, I go back into After Effects and I import all my image sequences. I want to make sure that the frame rate is set correctly. In this case, it was 24 frames per second. And I updated it on all clips because it might vary on whatever preferences you have set in After Effects. And then I'm gonna start creating a composition where I will drop in all my render layers in and rebuild my image. I want to put the background at the very bottom, then the ground, then the wall, then the all holes layer, and then I bring all individual holes in as well. Now I'm gonna add a hue saturation node to the holes, and I'm gonna crank up the brightness quite a bit so that the entire layer will turn white. And this is just for temporarily to work on this, because I want to now figure out the timing of when I want each hole to show up. So I copy the hue saturation effect on all holes, and from here on out I will go through the edit and mark in and out points of where I now want this hole to be highlighted. And I'm going to use Alt plus open bracket to set the in point, and then Alt plus closed bracket to set the out point. And I'm going to set this up for each individual hold. I'm going to go through my layer and just do a little rough pass of how I want this to be revealed. With the timing in place, something that I like to do is actually take the layer that has all holes visible on it. I put it at the beginning and at the end of my clip, just as like a indication of what the overall route looks like. It's just something that I found very useful and something that I ended up doing. Now let's get rid of any excess work area. So I want to trim the comp to work area. And then I'm going to add another hue saturation node to the wall itself. And something that I also like to do is just darken the wall so that the holes pop a little bit more. Then I'm going to go through all my individual holes layers, and I will start keying the transparency or the opacity so that the holes are being revealed. So I do a value of 0 into a value of 100. I also like to press F9 to switch them from linear to Bezier. This gives it a little bit more of an ease in, ease out feeling. And then I'm gonna repeat this for each individual hold, just so that they don't suddenly pop into place, but have a nice little fade in, fade out on them. And this is what this first pass looks like. Next, I'm actually going to get rid of all the hue saturation nodes by selecting all my layers and then right-clicking onto them and say Effect, Remove All. Then instead, I will actually be adding a Lumetri color node. That's just a little bit of a more fancy color correction node, and a Deep Glow, which is again a paid plugin. You can also use the Glow node within After Effects, but what I like to do now is actually once again duplicate this layer and then have different settings on the top layer. So I actually like to have a brighter glow at the bottom layer and then a less brighter glow on the top layer. And there you can also change a little bit the other settings and find a look that matches your style. Once I have a recipe that I like, I actually duplicate each hold to have 2 layers, and then I'm just gonna select all top layers and will copy the effects from the top layer that I created on there. And then I'm gonna select all bottom layers and apply the effects from the bottom layer that I had. And now you should still have the same transparency animation on there and everything should look nice and polished. Now let's add the 3D to our edit, and I'm gonna take the 3D sequence. I'm just gonna drop it into our main edit here, and I'm gonna extend the edit a little bit to give me some extra space. I'm gonna shift everything over that it looks nicely. And I wanna make sure again that this layer is also set to 3D because we are using cameras. I wanna also make sure that the camera from the first shot is actually extended over the 3D as well, because they are based on the same shot, so they can use the same camera and we want this to feel seamless. Then in this case, because they aren't matching yet, something that I need to do is actually set this to 3D because it is a 3D camera, and currently they don't match perfectly yet. It might be due to the position not being the same, but because my videos are shot in 4K and the render that we did is in 2K, means that we set the 3D layer to a scale of 200 to make them both match perfectly. And now when we press play, they transition seamlessly into each other. Now during the camera pan, I want to make sure that we aren't zoomed in, so I'm taking the first keys of my camera that I know show the entire frame, and I'm gonna paste them a little further down into the 3D so that we always see the entire frame of our rendering. Something I didn't like on my first run through is actually that all holes aren't being shown long enough for the viewer to register what the layout of the climb is. So I'm actually creating a duplicate of my 3D layer that I set to freeze frame on the first frame of my layer. And I'm gonna move this one out a little bit to just give me some extra time for this to read a little bit longer before the actual camera animation starts. Now on that 3D layer that's extending over my first shot, I start drawing a mask that is kind of like this weird zigzag pattern of shapes. And this is what I will use to reveal it on top of the actual video. Once this shape is drawn roughly into place, I will make sure that I close it and I just draw a giant square. And then on the first frame, I will press M to go to the masked path, and I will move everything out of frame. And now actually the 3D has disappeared because this path is revealing the image. So further down the timeline, I will now select the paths that I want to move, and I'm going to move them in the opposite corner of my image. And now when I scrub through, it'll start animating into frame. Now this still looks a little bit generic, and I want to make sure that actually motion blur is enabled. I also tighten a little bit the timing of this, and you can enable motion blur on the layer itself, and it is this little checkbox here. And now with this enabled, you can see that it actually feels a little bit more dynamic already. It blurs the edges much nicer when it's coming in, but I'm still gonna press F to access the mask feather, and I will make the overall path a little bit more blurred. And this will just make the transition feel a little bit softer, a little bit nicer. It's personal preference, but it's something I like to do. Now I just take my layers and I move them over the edit so that they start overlapping. One thing I want to make sure is, because I actually started cutting my cameras in half, that they share the same keys across each other, because otherwise the images won't match. Now this looks pretty cool already, but I actually like to go a little step further, and I like to bring in the rotoscope from the same shot and have it continue over the 3D for a little bit. So I once again make sure that the rotoscope layer matches with my other layers, and I set it to 3D and copy the position from one layer to the other layer that they perfectly match in space. And then, just like we did in the previous sections of the tutorial, we try to match the rotoscope with the video underneath, and I try to find an area with big motion so that then I can just move the rotoscope back and forth and find that matching frame. Now as a last step, I want to make sure that my rotoscope also animates out, so I set a few opacity keys on that layer and just animate it from 100 to 0 to disappear. Lastly, because we animated the 3D in, we also now have to animate it out again, and this is actually super easy. I will just grab all the following clips and I will overlap the next clip with my 3D, and then I'm going back onto the 3D layer where I drew this squiggly mask that reveals the 3D, copy it and paste it onto the next clip after the 3D layer. And with that mask on there, it's already animating in perfectly. Now, because the dimensions have changed, I just need to reconfigure this real quick on the first frame. So I just double click onto the path, which selects everything on it, and I can just scale it up and I move it out of frame. And then I go to the next keyframe and then I will double click on the path again, scale everything up and move it so it covers everything. And this should already be enough to have the next shot be revealed on top of the edit. And then when I play back, boom, this already works perfectly, and I am done with this transition as well. Once again, to make this look a little bit cooler, I want to bring in the rotoscope of this clip, and I will have it overlap with the 3D and then reveal me walking in on the actual shot. We want to make sure that the rotoscope is set to 3D and that the positions match with the actual 3D sequence underneath, just so that they perfectly overlap. Now in this case, I don't have to retime the roto because the clip underneath and the actual roto match exactly, so I just have to make sure that they start at the same time. And now when you press play, you see that the actual rotoscope is not moving with the camera motion. That's because that camera motion that we're seeing is actually from the 3D rendering. So in this case, I hand animate the position of my rotoscope and use the position of my head and the first big hole on the wall as a reference point for me to move it down in space and just animate it roughly where it needs to be. And I just make my way backwards and try to roughly match it until I'm out of frame. And this should probably be enough, so I can just get rid of the front part of that clip. And then when I press play, I am being revealed into camera, and it feels like I'm straight walking into that 3D scene, and then the wipe comes and I'm in the actual set. It always makes sense to go actually into the graph editor and clean your curves a little bit, because by default they are linear, which feels a little bit generic. So I want to make sure they have Béziers on them and they are just a little bit more rounder, a little bit more organic. And here's our final video. And this concludes our tutorial. I hope you were able to learn something valuable from this session. Because I'm a super small channel, please like and subscribe to this video. This really helps me to create more content on the future. If you could tag me on Instagram and TikTok, I'm super curious to see what you guys make with all this info, and I can't wait to see what you come up with. Thanks so much. See you guys soon. Bye bye.